The mission of this podcast is to investigate symbolism and human language to uncover deep truths about life, the universe, and everything. More broadly, symbolism, language, and religion are some of the most misunderstood, yet most important and powerful tools available to us feeble humans today, not only to understand the world, but to communicate it and to live a joyful, meaningful life. Symbolism shows us that the universe is arranged into patterns of being to which meaning arises, that nothing is truly random, and that accidents, if true, are a breakdown of meaning. Symbols are fundamental in our biology as genes, and in the abstract world of language as memes and archetypes. Language is the way in which we use patterns assigned or revealed to interpret and describe the universe, and all contained within it. Language is the spoken and written word, the logos in action, but also footprints in sand, the behavior of our peers, the constellations, and paintings on a cave wall. Religion is many things, but not dismissible. It is belief instantiated in symbol, language, but most critically, action, which in pattern forms ritual. Ritual which acknowledges and binds us to the spiritual realm. I want to help bridge the understanding of the ancient symbolic worldviews and that of the disjointed modern and postmodern perspectives. If that sounds like gibberish to you, well, that's okay. Part of this podcast is to help explain in narrative form how language and symbols are embedded into everything and why that matters and how understanding that can help you live a more peaceful, successful life. In this show, we look at how ancient perspectives about life, the world, the spiritual and physical realms creep up in the modern day, and why religious, spiritual ritual, and symbolic thinking is unavoidable even in the disenchanted scientific age. In this show, we use movies, books, TV, and history to dive into the symbolic and linguistic themes in every area of interest. And through that, we also discuss how to live a more peaceful, meaningful, good, virtuous, jolly, and holy life, whether you're an atheist, agnostic, Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, or pagan, all by studying those who came before us. Join me. My name is Max, host of the Etymos Max podcast and YouTube channel. Welcome to episode 6 of the Etymos podcast. Today we will be talking about the movie Unhinged. This is partially a movie review, but also just diving deep into a bunch of philosophical and symbolic themes found all throughout this movie and how it relates to our everyday life and modern American Western culture. So with that said, this podcast episode contains spoilers from the 2020 film Unhinged, starring Russel Crowe, Caren Pistorius, and Gabriel Bateman, and directed by Derek Forte. So, as I record this, it is the second week of January 2022. There have been some very cold days this winter so far, with averages in the teens and the 20s Fahrenheit, and other days with highs of 55 with rainstorms. The snow has only come in small flurries, and we await the larger storms of the season. Regardless of this, the bitterness, the starkness of the winter persists, and even though the days grow longer, they too grow colder, and the nights are brought to complete stillness, nearly devoid of life. Nevertheless, the evergreen out of my window reminds me to persist through the winter and remain vigilant, both this winter on Earth, physically, and the spiritual winter that inundates our culture, fettering many. We must not despair, for in every darkest day there is hope for the light. Coming out of this holiday season, my family caught and has been recovering from COVID, the Omicron, or whatever it's being called, myself included. I had it and have since recovered. And it has been rough on our bodies, but also our time and attention, having to go great distances to get medicine and to take up treatment measures. Nonetheless, I think it has brought us closer, and even though we are 2 years into this pandemic, it seems we are approaching, all of us, if not the end, at least a landing point or a point of rest we can have amid all the craziness of the world and the lockdowns and restrictions and the death of disease and the real threat of that. So hopefully we're approaching a landing point, if not the end. But anyway, let's talk about this episode. This episode will be airing as episode 6. However, I have been working on the script since I was working on the scripts for episodes 1, 2, and 3. And I started the script even before the first episode was released. So it has been many months in the making, and only in these last few weeks in the beginning of 2022 have I felt that I finally have the minimum adequate knowledge about the subject matter to finish this episode. I've been reading more of Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky and The Crisis of the Modern World by René Guénon, and the the language of creation, symbolism in Genesis by Mathieu Pajot. So all these books and a few more and different videos and lectures I've been listening to, I think have really been able to form me and inform me into a position where I can speak a little bit more knowledgeably on the themes that I originally outlined in the script. So it's been a labor of love, so I hope you enjoy it. In July 2020, amidst the pandemic and massive social unrest, a movie called Unhinged came out in theaters. It was one of the only new movies in theaters, and it was Unhinged that tested the waters after the first wave of lockdowns. Starring Russel Crowe and Caren Pistorius, Unhinged is a story of two people, a man and a woman, who are strangers depicted as highly flawed with questionable motives. The two are thrown together in a battle of life or death, not in a gladiatorial arena, but on the roadways. It is a film with a hyper-exaggerated theme of road rage and excessive, near-meaningless retribution. Yet despite the irrational behavior of both main characters, the narrative remains believable to the viewer. Now, before I get into the breakdown of this film, it is important to give you a few things to consider. When first starting this podcast, I thought of not doing movie reviews, especially modern thrillers, as they often stray far away from my interests and focus of this channel. Although, this will not be a movie review in any traditional sense. Movies, TVs, books, comics, and other forms of modern storytelling are a way to bridge the understanding of modern, postmodern, and pre-modern ways of storytelling. That being said, there are many themes the writers and directors of Unhinged touched upon that were wholly unexpected, many of which drew me in. On a Saturday evening, my parents and I were going to watch a movie on Amazon, and I was trusted with finding a film that we would all enjoy. Typically for us, movies on Amazon can be hit or miss, both for our tastes and the user reviews. An average movie we watch might have a few hundred, if not 1,000 or 2,000 reviews with 4+ stars. Nevertheless, Unhinged stood out to me because it not only had 4.5 stars, but it also had 60,000+ reviews. And that's all for a 91-minute film, which really isn't that long compared to a lot of movies made today. By a certain demographic principle, it had to be good, right? Well, that's if you don't believe in argumentum ad populum. We watched the movie, and from the outset, we were hooked. It was not necessarily enjoyable, but it played heavily and quite strategically on a panoply of emotions and senses. Suspense, terror, surprise, anticipation, hope, hopelessness, panic, confusion, and relief. In essence, it was a joy derived from the thrill, like an hour-and-a-half roller coaster. The story itself was not particularly sophisticated or cerebral like the high-stakes science fiction film Interstellar, but the themes touched upon and the dynamics between the characters were thought-provoking, even if much of the details of the story were left vague, intentionally. So on a channel about language learning, symbolism, religion, history, and philosophy, why talk about this movie? Well, Unhinged, as it constantly surprises its viewers, is surprisingly tied to the themes of this channel by provoking deep philosophical questions such as, why is there evil in this world? Why do innocent people have to suffer? Why do we hope? How can we act so as not to become evil? Does good and evil even exist? So let's dive in. The banality of evil. First, let's discuss that term most people have heard of, but might not yet fully grasp. That term is the banality of evil. What is the banality of evil? Let's define some terms. Banality, or banal, is a word that we generally do not see or read in any other context than this phrase of the banality of evil. It is not a common word. For something to be banal is for that thing to be trite, obvious, predictable, or commonplace. Coming from an old French word, banal, meaning communal, itself deriving from the word ban, meaning decree, legal control, announcement, authorization, payment for use of a communal oven or mill, etc. Interestingly enough, and from an even earlier source, it means a public proclamation, or to speak publicly. So we can say it means evil as commonplace or ubiquitous evil, evil that is everywhere, or commonly accepted, or more accurate to its original usage, evil that is perpetrated so boringly and so detached from who it affects, it can hardly be seen as evil when understanding the position of the perpetrator. The term banality of evil was popularized by journalist and Jew Hannah Arendt in her book Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil, 1963, where she talks about the trial of Adolf Eichmann for his organization of the transport of millions of Jews in the Holocaust, that is to say, the transport of millions of Jews to their death. What grabs many people is her rather unimpressed description of the man, who acts and appears to be an ordinary man, an ordinary bureaucrat, who sought promotion in his work, that he was, quote, neither perverted nor sadistic, end quote, as one might expect. Because he was a bureaucrat, she argues that he never truly realized what it was he was doing, because he was unable to see what he was doing from the standpoint of anyone else. That is to say, the victims were faceless names, or more often, just numbers to him, like an accountant squaring accounts. Now, Eichmann, in my view, was very much a probably rather boring, unassuming bureaucrat in his day to day, nevertheless fully responsible for his actions. One can be fairly detached or blind from the consequences of their actions, especially today, with the advent of the internet and social media. One still must own their actions, even if they cannot see their own end. I believe modern America is suffering a moral malaise, much like a banality of evil, for a variety of reasons, but directly because we simultaneously are fiercely individualistic, wanting to be left alone in our freedoms to do anything, yet we place a litany of demands on others to conform to our beliefs, politics, and lifestyles. A tyranny of the extremes of freedom and totalitarian impulses. This is the contradiction of modern America, and, to an extent, the modern West. But most specifically America. Many of us, regardless of political persuasion, act simultaneously as the rugged individualist while also playing the part of the brutal totalitarian in our politics, in our relationships, and how we treat ourselves. From day to day, or even hour to hour, or minute to minute, we teeter between either extreme because we lack a psychologically integrated view of authority. That is to say, our views on authority are contradictory and highly flawed. We can see this clearly in the movie Unhinged, with both main characters who act out both absolute entitlement and demands for personal free reign over their perceived domain. This is the common characteristic of the totalitarian and the rugged individualist, who, like the communist and fascist, are more alike than different, and, as it is said, are two rival gangs fighting over the same territory, that devolve into a ripe hell by failing to realize an unrealizable utopia this side of heaven. Now, rant aside, back to the banality of evil and Unhinged. The movie Unhinged, like all good stories, serves as a microcosm of reality in all, or a culture in a specific time as it is in a given context. Thus, the story is often a condensed narrative form of what a culture is experiencing that produces that story. We can think about Karl Marx's grand narrative, that is, the class struggle of capitalist, industrialist elite bourgeois oppressors enslaving and exploiting the oppressed proletariat working class as a product of Marx's life, the 19th century he lived in, and the cultures of Europe and the broader West at the time. His narrative describes the world he lived in a condensed format from his perspective. We can also think of more intentional stories, like the narrative of Star Wars, a story of a rebellion against a massive technological bureaucratic empire, as one that reflects an American culture that emerged from the Vietnam War, a time of great protests, and a post-World War II era. In our modern context, we have become detached from the evil acts we perpetrate and their consequences, as stated before. For one example, when we write and repost inflammatory political posts on social media to score a quick point against our friends, co-workers, family members, classmates, strangers, and even celebrities, we're actually creating an ever greater divide on each and every issue. And more to the heart of it, we are destroying our communities with our smug deceit, which we instinctively know is slightly off-kilter from the whole truth. This is what Dr. Jordan B. Peterson warns about when he says to not engage in the unholy trinity of resentment, deceit, and arrogance. To drive this point home about the banality of evil, we have become so numb to our boring, consumerist, nihilistic, chaotic, decentered, communitylist lives that when we only wake up for but a moment when a child goes and shoots up their school, we then dare to ask why. Many lament that it is a tragedy that we have accepted school shootings as a new normal, which is absolutely correct. We should be appalled by our numbness towards the regularity of any such tragedies. However, The error of our reaction, which the movie Unhinged points out, is that our reaction is only just that, a reaction. Our culture sees shootings, or the murder rampage, or riot, or child predation, or outburst of nihilism as the beginning and end of tragedy, and fails to see that the very conditions of our culture, of our overly materialistic, communityless, decentered culture of broken families, and no binding spirituality, creates the seedbed for an excess of nihilistic destructive outbursts. Every person who commits such acts are responsible, don't get me wrong, but that being said, we mustn't understate the effect of environment, of community, of culture, of family, of mentorship, or lack thereof. Largely, the incomprehensible monstrosities of the two world wars broke the psyches and spirits of modern Westerners, which is reflected in the artwork to follow the wars, that deviates from objective beauty standards and archetypes and relishes in hideously subjective, meaningless, boundless shapes and interpretive themes. Ironically, it is World War II that shattered the modern mind and gave us phrases like "never again" in reference to genocide, yet we know it has occurred many times since, and occurs actively now, yet nobody cares. We recognize that a certain apathy led to World War II, and much of what we do today is defined by World War II, yet we march onwards in our pursuits with the same numbness. Leading up to World War II, when there was a political assassination or instance of mob violence in Italy, when asked to comment on the tragedies, Mussolini's fascists simply refrained to an all too common phrase, common to us, which is "me ne frego," which in English means, "I don't care." Many of our culture's best efforts at achieving meaning in life fall short because the ideologies, movements, and quote-unquote communities we start are not grounded in anything meaningful or transcendent. They are only grounded in a rational materialism that is only capable of picking apart the wisdom of the past, but incapable of understanding it. Wisdom cannot be invented or engineered, as someone like Brett Weinstein might suggest. Wisdom cannot be dug up out of the ground and made from material origins, unless what is dug up is a seed from heaven, symbolically speaking, or as used in Jack and the Beanstalk, a bag of magic beans. Materialism is useful in that it supplies understanding. It serves as embodiment for spiritual truths, but only when spiritual truths, that is to say symbols, icons, are believed to be true. Wisdom comes from above. It is not invented by us. It is only revealed or brought down to us by capital T tradition. Wisdom, that is to say spiritual truth, lands on material embodiment and understanding and supports it. Wisdom and understanding, when covering and supporting each other, synthesize or reveal knowledge. Matter and spirit help each other. Matter, when organized, can reveal a spiritual truth, and spiritual truths can describe an abstract truth observed from a set of material realities. The universe is simultaneously one thing and many things. It is the unity of the spirituality and heaven, and it is the multiplicity of matter and earth. With all that said, rant, exposition, symbolic speaking, and all, let's look at how Unhinged uses dualism to tell a story of good and evil, and how that compares and contrasts with Gnostic and traditional Christian views on good versus evil. Evil, the Gnostic vision. Gnosticism is a philosophical and religious belief that is an offshoot of the Christian tradition and cropped up several times in the history of Christianity as heresy. Heresy, etymologically meaning choice, to choose, or to seize, or to take, in that it takes one extreme position of two or more counterbalancing positions laid out within a larger belief system, and heresy asserts the one selected position as the only true of all the necessary positions for a properly integrated belief system. Thereby, heresy implies some sort of choice of an imbalance. Heresy sees the world in very simple terms, and itself does not simply mean a diversion of accepted beliefs. So why do I talk about heresy? This heresy of Gnosticism asserts that evil is a dualistic force that is on equal footing with the good. Evil and good are like brothers that balance each other out, as opposed to reality being fundamentally good or fundamentally evil. In this system, the Gnostics believe that the created world, slash matter slash the body, the material world, is evil and is in opposition to the spiritual, which is seen as pure and good. The Gnostics divided people between those who are carnal of the flesh, so more materialistic people, and they saw those people as inferior, and those who are spiritual as superior. Only the superior spiritual person could hope to access the secret revelatory knowledge necessary to free the human soul for salvation. However, this is an obviously flawed conception of humanity and the world. Neither the body slash material world nor the spirit is fully good or evil. Both can be good, but both can be tainted to do evil, and do to evil. As what exists is naturally good, but it can be warped, corrupted for evil purposes. A privation and perversion of good. I will address this further on when we reach the inevitable definition of evil. To see an example of how spirituality can be either good or evil, look no further than the spiritual beings of angels, who are either good and called angels, or are evil and are called devils or demons. Idol worship is another example of perverted spirituality. It's idol worship in more modern secular terms it's a misalignment of priorities or of values. And what it leads to is that an evil spirit, that is to say, something which is not the supreme value, is worshipped as opposed to God, who is goodness itself. Let's look further into Gnostic duality and duality more broadly. Now, Gnosticism's view on duality is clearly flawed, but duality itself is not inherently wrong. Duality exists everywhere, as differentiation is necessary to define one another. Something is not short if there is nothing tall to compare it to. There is no north if there is no south. Darkness is defined by the absence of light, cold the absence of heat. That is duality by a lack of certain quality, but there is also dichotomy, where things of a like category can be placed in opposition to another. In the film Unhinged, we can see the two main characters fall into a classic narrative dualistic dichotomy of protagonist and antagonist, although with a twist on what common factor drives into conflict the characters of the man and Rachel. In the deepest sense, their shared commonality is their clearly flawed personalities and inability to act forthrightly in their relationships. Most readily on display is their failed marriages and the suspicion of infidelity in both of their respective marriages. But we also see other, more surface-level commonalities that pit the two as adversaries. Both are irritable, careless drivers, and simply, they are both drivers of motor vehicles. That's the common theme in the movie. That is, the setting of the movie is on the road. The film creators put careful attention to detail to portray both Rachel, the protagonist, and the man as highly flawed individuals. Yes, Rachel is not given a last name, and the man, played by Russel Crowe, is not even given a name at all, and for good reason. His name is only revealed in a background newsreel after he is well into his rampage. So, let's talk about the symbolism of the night and of seeds. The movie opens with a man tossing his wedding ring in the back of his truck parked outside a house at night, then breaking into that house and then murdering who is presumed to be his cheating wife and her lover, setting the house ablaze, then leaving the crime scene. The fact that the story begins with a murderous rampage and at night sets the mood and symbolic frame in which the movie takes place. It's really important when we read a book or watch a movie, those first few paragraphs, that first chapter, is really what sets the tone for the entire book. And oftentimes the whole story itself is contained symbolically in that first instance. But let's talk about this one a little bit more. So night is associated with darkness, the unknown, potential, and chaos that lay just beyond our vision, illuminated by the ancestral campfire. Darkness can also symbolize meaninglessness. In the dark of night, our imagination generates all the terrors that could be hiding in the jet black night because our ancestors could not afford to take chances on a potential predator hidden from our sight. Think of it this way: the monster under the bed, the bump in the night, the bear growling near a campsite, or the suspicious man walking down the street, only visible by the streetlights. Night is a place of mystery and potential, a literal seedbed for the unknown future. A seedbed in the sense that what will happen has yet to be revealed, just as a seed is buried, hidden from sight, and emerges only then revealing its nature and what the soil hides. Night also is associated with sleep, and thus unconsciousness, which alludes to vulnerability. For this reason, and calling back to episode 1, the symbol of a closed eye is a symbol of unconsciousness and the night. But in regard to the night, how can one be truly 100% sure they are safe? They're not even conscious of the potential dangers around them. Is that not a major fear of parents for their families? Is that not a fear of children? Of break-ins and burglaries in the middle of the night? That is to say, the dragon of chaos, the monster under the bed, the lion in the bushes, or the snake in our tent? Much of our safety is outsourced and prepared for us. Yes, some may protect their homes with bats or other weapons, but most Westerners are protected in a concentric set of rings of institutions. Our house is immediately protected by the eyes and ears of our neighbors, or even security systems. Our neighborhoods perhaps by neighborhood watches. Our towns by law enforcement and first responders. Our provinces and countries by national military forces. Justice systems and prisons. Although, like any institution, these are not without flaw, and potential for corruption and inversion can easily occur to take us from protect and serve to persecute and enslave. Within the film, an opening with an attack at night signifies that the dangers the protagonist and innocents within the story will face will be unexpected, seemingly out of nowhere, and indiscriminate. We can also infer that the violence that will be had will almost seem completely meaningless, random, and unpredictable. If we do not know what a seed is from, we can only know by planting it and watching it grow just as we watch the plot unfold. The first scene beautifully encapsulates the symbolism of the seed. We can look at it and infer what to expect, but we cannot truly know until the plot unfolds, and like the seed buried or the creature in the night, we cannot know what it is until its fruit is born to us. Instead of a protagonist proactively going out into the world to confront evil, as in the hero's journey as often it plays out, evil will approach the protagonist unexpectedly, forcing them to wake up or become conscious of the bump of the night, which, depending on your interpretation, can be within the hero's journey or not. I will say that it is, but the way it's done in this movie seems to be particularly different, where the hero is completely passive, or the quote-unquote hero is completely passive throughout the entire movie. An unexpected protagonist. Rachel is introduced the next morning also in the context of a dysfunctional family dynamic as a mom who's going through a divorce and is allowing her unemployed brother and his girlfriend to live with her, rent-free. She's also portrayed as careless with her time, missing appointments, not showing up to work on time, being fired, and repeatedly being late in taking her son to school. Where there is definitely a personification of evil incarnate in the character of the man, how Rachel's character is written prevents her from being a cut-and-dry archetype of the good. No knight in shining armor like Joan of Arc, or even a benevolent, honorable queen such as Padme Amidala. And although the man is absolutely unjustified in his brutal actions, one can feel some catharsis in the initial confrontation between Rachel and the man at the stoplight. One might call this karma for her deliberate ineptitude and excessive pride in not willing to apologize for impatience showed towards the man. Or in the Christian context, as told in the book of Job, quote, "As I have seen, those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same." End quote. Again, another expression of that universal symbolism of the seed. You reap what you sow. It is something of a pitting of evil against not good, but indifference, leaving Rachel to act in a way to desire good to happen to her without her having to do good herself, which is a callback to the numbness towards evil that we discussed, the moral malaise I described, which relates to the banality of evil. In other words, she wants goodness and virtue to be directed towards her and how she is treated, while simultaneously choosing to be rude and vicious towards others. I see this as a psychological dependency on a paternal figure to solve her problems for her, and whisk her out of trouble she does not take responsibility for. We can see this paternal dependency and obfuscation of responsibility in her relationship with her lawyer friend, who is legally representing Rachel in the divorce. For free. If that doesn't say anything, I don't know what does. A lot could be said about this entitled attitude, but I will keep it short and say that her character embodies the attitude of many in modern life. Many of us are so used to the concentric circles of safety, protection, and easy access to plentiful goods and services, often for cheap, that we do not realize how much they are worth, or we do not even realize that they are there until they are not there. The movie also leaves the lawyer friend's motivation less than clear, and the man even suggests he is the one Rachel is cheating on, or that the lawyer is playing the quote-unquote nice guy in order to get with Rachel, although there is no definitive answer given. But like many things in the movie, I think the writers leave it purposely vague to allow the viewer to suspect and doubt the good motives of the main characters, and for good reason. To speak more on all the characters, not just one, the story purposefully does not provide too much detail into any of the characters' lives, as to counterintuitively allow the viewer to more readily sympathize with the characters, putting the viewer into the movie. A good example of this writing strategy can be seen in the character of the Master Chief of the video game series Halo, where both the dialogue, name, and background information of Chief is obscured or minimally provided to allow the player to more fully project themselves into Master Chief, who they play as. It is a clever writing and developing tool to create immersion. You can either create a character that is broadly relatable by clearly defined experiences and characteristics, or you can make a character relatable by leaving them vague, allowing our own psychology as the viewer or player to project ourselves into the story. Let's talk about modern evil. I alluded to how this movie clearly breaks away from traditional adventure stories, so let's talk about those modern narrative heroes and the modern view on evil. Modern Western storytelling of the last few centuries, but especially the last few decades, is wrought with a sort of cynicism that assumes even good intentions of any individual to be a persona, facade, a thinly veiled veneer employed to disguise someone's true selfish intentions. Moreover, that an act of charity is at best patronizing and manipulative. Within the modern cynical narratives, there is no longer room for the classical hero who represents fully good intentions and a solid morality that produces good outcomes for himself or others, largely because we, and the characters we write, lack good, wise, solid mentors or ideal persons to follow or take advice from. And this goes back to the disintegrated view of authority. For example, we substitute Gandalf, Yoda, and Merlin for Harry Morgan from the show Dexter, or the deadbeat dad version of older Han Solo in the newer Star Wars films. I think a partial explanation for this goes back to the modern American disintegrated attitudes towards authority. We have two extreme views on authority, and no balanced, traditional, functional understanding of how hierarchical authority is supposed to work, so we dispense of it altogether or enact authority in its most totalitarian forms. That said, part of traditional and well-integrated authority, such as in organized religion, is a system that keeps us humble and gives us authoritative sources in which we can receive correction from to become better, either from above, from authorities, or by brothers and sisters in our congregation who offer us fraternal correction and thus expect it in return. Today, we do not have such stable systems of authority where we seek out advice or receive correction, because the people who can offer us correction are at best our friends who are bound to us for no other reason than having similar interests, as opposed to being mutually belonging and subscribing to ancient and complex practical systems, such as we see with religion like Catholicism or Hinduism. But back to modern storytelling. An excellent mark of storytelling is to have characters who are complex in that they may be good but struggle with temptations of evil. As the Solzhenitsyn quote goes, the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being, and who is willing to destroy a piece of his own heart? End quote. Think no further than J.R.R. Tolkien's character Frodo Baggins, who in The Lord of the Rings must bear the responsibility to destroy the Ring of Power, and thus must continually fight off the temptation to use it for his own selfish desires, and so must those who help Frodo along the way. The whole mission to destroy the ring is one of selfless love, for the selfish desire to profit from the ring comes at the expense of the good by triumph of evil, because the user's selfish lust, greed, and distraction will ultimately be exploited for the ring to be stolen by the manifestation of evil itself, that is to say, Sauron, the antagonist of the book and films. Nevertheless, Many heroes depicted today are incapable of resisting temptation and often fall to it. A hero is often depicted as a bad person, or even a villain, who must be recruited for the forces of good and often does morally questionable acts to achieve the good. The blatant examples that come to mind are the Marvel Cinematic Universe's Loki or Deadpool, or Darth Vader, who becomes a genocidal, rampaging space dictator before he can be redeemed only at the last possible moment. Although I will note that Darth Vader ultimately repents and does not try to turn his evil deeds into some good result. He recants his evil and simply does good. The most recent depictions of the villain the Joker fit the description. And even Batman's flawed yet principled character in most recent iterations gives into the temptation to murder his enemies, violating his famous ethic of no killing to stop crime. Even the Ring of Power in The Lord of the Rings was not destroyed by Frodo's will to do good, and the character of Faramir was rewritten for the movies directed by Peter Jackson to depict Faramir as incapable of denying himself the ring. Also, other characters who could resist the ring and with ease in the Lord of the Rings books were cut out of the movies altogether. Now, let's get back to Unhinged and how modern conceptions of good and evil play out in the characters. In Unhinged, the absolute minimal good required of Rachel is in making a simple, meaningful apology to the man. She does not apologize until late into the movie, and the man correctly points out that it is not a true apology, but only a recitation of words to achieve her half-hearted desire for the torment of others to end. She does not have a contrite heart. Her pride comes in the way of her being truly repentant, even as her friends and loved ones are dying. A placing of her own pride over the love of others. To me, that was one of the most relatable scenes in the movie, because I have been in positions, and I'm sure we all have been, where I was given the choice to sacrifice my pride for myself, or more importantly for others, or I could continue in my pride. And if my heart was not into a repenting mood against my own pride, I would make the wrong decision. So I honestly felt for Rachel. It is nearly impossible, though, to make a meaningful apology when your heart and soul are just not ready to do so. That's why it's important to have a contrite heart when you are recanting or repenting of something that you've done or trying to apologize. Like, what use is an apology if you say sorry but you don't mean it? The other person can tell right away if you mean it or not. But sometimes their pride can get in the way when you're trying to give a genuine apology and they won't accept it. And they'll assert, like, you don't mean it. But again, it's the same issue just on the other person, an issue of pride, not willing to give up a little bit of face in order to make a proper amendment. Anyways, when she is given multiple opportunities to sacrifice a sliver of her ego in exchange for the lives of those she knows and or loves, she instead chooses to sacrifice the life of her former client who fired her. When the movie is put in those terms, it sounds almost ridiculous that she would still be unapologetic. Yet I can very much sympathize from that place of pride she was coming from. People, myself most certainly included, will sacrifice relationships, opportunities, money, relationships with God, and their spiritual community, or just community in general, and all manner of things, just to not sacrifice their pride, their ego. They'll do that to not admit they are wrong, and make a firm purpose amendment to right their wrong. I mean, it's absolutely unbelievable, like just in reading history or just dealing with people in my own life, how far people will go just to not admit they're wrong about something. I've been there. It's kind of crazy, but it's so very human. And here we become the biggest obstacle for our own healing. Which leads me to ask, how can we become truly sorry for something when we do not yet feel sorry? Like, what is it that gets us to that point of feeling sorry? Or should we even be feeling sorry? Can we give a genuine apology without actually feeling sorry or feeling that guilt? Those are the questions that I'm just throwing out for you to think about, for myself to think about, because it's an important question to ask, I think. When watching the movie and then looking it over, I found that to be particularly odd and somewhat ironic, that there really is not any proactive force of good within the movie. That is to say, there is no virtuous person or even someone striving to be virtuous. The police are portrayed as incompetent, incapable of intervening until evil itself, as manifested in the man, is extinguished or exhausted. The good or good actions or goodness, that is the opposite of evil, is just portrayed as something accidental or something reached by surviving or destroying the evil in others, as opposed to encountering the evil within ourselves. In that evil versus indifference, as made manifest in the man and Rachel, we see the narrative structure, and thus the morality of the postmodern world we live in emerge. The culture we live in lacks a substantial, consistent theory of what is good, with a capital G, and thus does not understand how to counter evil or to even understand what evil is. You will even see armchair philosophers, not excluding myself from this category, talk about how we need to, quote-unquote, reclaim villainy, or slough off the, quote-unquote, outdated understanding of good versus evil. If you do not accurately know what your enemy is, how can you hope to defeat it? A problem defined is one step away from being a problem solved. Thus, when we obscure what a problem is and even the nature of evil, we cannot hope to fight it or be prepared when sin is crouching at our door. Which is why the modern solution to confronting evil appears to either find an arbitrary scapegoat to sacrifice, or create as much chaos as possible, destroying everything and hoping evil is vanquished in the process. Today, if good is even considered to be a real force, it is given the Gnostic understanding that good and evil are on equal footing, these equally powerful, that ultimately, at best, good and evil can cancel each other out, produce a neutral world. But as it was pointed out in a conversation between Orthodox icon carver Jonathan Pageau, Father Andrew Damick, and Father Stephen DeYoung, discussing the podcast Lord of Spirits, there can be no neutral spirits vacant of good or evil. The two priests pointed out that even those perhaps neutral figures we look up to eventually are put in the position to choose from good or evil. And as Archbishop Fulton Sheen once said, the refusal to take sides on a great moral issue is itself a decision. It is a silent acquiescence of evil. The tragedy of our time is that those who still believe in honesty lack fire and conviction, while those who believe in dishonesty are full of passionate conviction. End quote. The sum of our lives can be judged. Did we do more good than evil? And if we did live vilely, did we die virtuously? So, if good and evil are not equal, which is more powerful? Do both exist? Let's discuss other ways of looking at evil. Good and evil in Buddhism and the Christian tradition. This episode has stretched on fairly long, so I want to offer a brief overview of an alternative view on evil. The world is full of many hypotheses and theories on the nature of evil and its origin. However, that does not mean all are correct or even accurate. We already covered the Gnostic view of good and evil as spiritual and material as bifurcated, divided forces. What about other theories on evil? In Buddhism, evil is neither a characteristic of someone nor is it an external force that acts on people or things. It's not a spirit like we might see in Christianity. Buddhist tradition generally rejects the Western conceptualization of good and evil. Buddhism generally rejects the idea that good are those things that are intrinsically good and evil are those things that are intrinsically bad. This religious system has kusala and akusala that are often translated as good and evil, and either lean towards good and evil, but are not wholly one or the other. As Westerners, we cannot simply give a one-to-one on this, so allow me to explain as best I understand it. Kusala, Kusula, is something like intelligence, skill, beneficial good, and that which removes affliction. Akusala, Akusula, is something like unintelligence and lack of skill as depression, melancholy, distraction, and laziness, or sloth. This system of akusala and kusala is a feature of the larger Buddhist understanding of karma, which can be defined as action, or acting, or doing, with a belief that everything is simply action that feeds into cause and effect, as opposed to moral and immoral action. You do something, and something will result. You reap something, or you sow something, and you will reap something. This is by no means a comprehensive outline of Buddhism, not at all, and I'm always seeking to be careful when stating the beliefs of others, especially when I do not subscribe to their beliefs. There are rays of truth within this conceptualization, as many of the aforementioned beliefs are seemingly coherent. But an issue with that abstraction is that it obfuscates clearly apparent aspects of the nature of reality, namely, that there are things that are innately moral and immoral, or good and evil, or in some sense we can say even practical and impractical. But back to Buddhism, we can say that something such as depression or laziness is not intrinsically bad because perhaps there are greater fruits which come from them. For example, in our indolence, our habitual laziness, we may come to know more clearly the future consequences of not performing our tasks, which may motivate us to do them. Or when we fail to do those duties, we may learn to become better by the consequence of not acting. By being too lazy to get gas soon after the low fuel light comes on in your car, this may cause you to break down, thus teaching you to not let your gas get so low again. Or not, you might repeat the same thing over and over again. But it needs to be pointed out that the good fruits of an evil act do not suddenly make the act not evil. And I know that can kind of sound weird to modern terms, that saying something like, or habitually letting your fuel tank get so low that you're going to run out in the middle of the road is evil. Like, a lot of people will not think of that as being evil. But as you'll see, and as I'm slowly explaining here, is that there is, when destruction and suffering and inconvenience and all these sorts of things crop up, and even laziness, these are all like evil, maybe not evil acts, but there's evil being, there's a spirit of evil being acted within them by failing. If we were to understand that the good is the opposite of the evil, and evil is the deprivation of the good, then we can say that not being vigilant, not being prepared, not being charitable to others is evil. It's the absence of charity, it's the absence of vigilance. But let's continue. Also, we can even do good things, but if they're not done in the right order and in light of a greater good, those good things risk turning into vices and idols that drag us down. What comes to mind is that family is a good, or physical fitness is a good. But when we put those as the most important things in our life, the supreme value of our life, we can find that we become a slave to them, and we lack a measure which guides us how to form relationships to family or to physical exercise. And also, it needs to be mentioned that, like, if family or physical exercise or health, we could say, physical health, are our highest value, it ends up collapsing in on themselves because there's going to be a time in most people's life when those things are not possible, when you can't agree with your family on a certain issue, so you kind of have to move back away from your family, even if you do love them. Or you might not be able to commit to physical exercise or to your health because of a debilitating disease or whatever it may be. So these are very, like, dependent things. However, if you have your supreme value as something a little bit more abstract, a little bit more able to be abstracted across a larger range of things, not just family and exercise as examples, then this is going to order your life a little bit better. So I'm going to explain that right here. In short, when we place transcendent values such as truth, goodness, and beauty, as well as the virtues of faith, hope, and charity above family and exercise, those lower things will, interestingly enough, benefit from them not being the absolute priority, and thus will be filled with truth, goodness, beauty, faith, hope, and charity. By focusing our attention on those higher values and virtues, the rest of our lives become more ordered, even and especially in the face of adversity. In brief, evil, as traditional Christians would understand it, is something like non-being, that is to say, non-existence. Evil is not a positive force, but is a subtraction and detraction from all things. Evil is the absence of the good, or the privation of the good. Evil, as it is non-being, cannot create, but it can only corrupt what has been made good or attempt to destroy it altogether. In essence, the very existence of evil actually only proves the existence and supremacy of goodness, because you can only have a deprivation of good when there is a good. Now, to continue my previous point, just because God can craft good outcomes out of terrible situations in what J.R.R. Tolkien describes or calls eucatastrophes, does not mean that evil does not exist. In other words, just because good always has the final say, and terrible situations can always be reinterpreted to produce positive changes in trajectory to beneficial outcomes, spiritually and or materially, that does not mean that evil doesn't exist. Rape is always evil. Murder is always evil. Theft is always evil, even when done for a seemingly virtuous end. Now, to bring this point home, I want to read an excerpt in a totally non-preachy manner from the Gospel according to St. John. I think this does a really good job at putting all these elements together and describing them in story format, in a sort of symbolic format that we can easily read and understand and just easily embody, I guess. So here it is. Jesus anointed at Bethany. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Here, a dinner was given in Jesus' honor. Martha served, while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with him. Then Mary took about a pint of pure nard, an expensive perfume. She poured it on Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, objected. "Why wasn't this perfume sold and money given to the poor? It's worth a year's wages." He did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. "Leave her alone," Jesus replied. "It was intended that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial. You will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me." Meanwhile, a large crowd of Jews found out that Jesus was there and came, not only because of him, but also to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. So the chief priests made plans to kill Lazarus as well, for on account of him, many of the Jews were going over to Jesus and believing in him. That is a reading from the Gospel of John, chapter 12, verses 1 through 11. Alright, so writing and editing this script for this episode has actually been one of the most enjoyable episodes to draft so far, and has nonetheless been an excellent spiritual and philosophical exercise. This may very well be the longest episode yet, and even still, I haven't even scratched the surface of what evil is and isn't, not to mention how to combat the many errors and issues the modern Western world falls into. I wanted to include a fairly large exploration on the idea of evil being the privation of the good, but I think it is best to split up the topic into a future installment of the podcast. Overall, I thoroughly enjoyed the movie Unhinged. The film was entertaining as a viewer, and it was fun to dissect the symbolism and philosophy it expresses. I prefer watching movies because of their time limit, which provides a challenge for the filmmakers to condense the story down to a few hours, at most, instead of hours on end that a TV series often provides. This condensed format of movies more readily provides a story that can be a microcosm, a story that captures the spirit of the culture, of the times, and a description of the world as seen in that time and by that artist. In all, if your heart and stomach can take a good thriller, I recommend Unhinged. Before you go, please stick around for the final thought after this brief message. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, comment, share, follow, subscribe, and leave a review on whatever app or podcasting platform you're on. Please share this with friends if you enjoyed it. Please share this to anyone who you think may benefit from this podcast. If you want to dive deeper into the topics discussed here, as well as how to acquire a second language in a fun and effective manner, go check out my new book, To Speak is the Sea, Unlocking the Dual Literate Generation. This book was a labor of love that I constructed over the course of 2 years, a love for language, psychology, storytelling, and symbolism that I transformed into a guide to live a more meaningful life by the ways of learning a language. You can find a paperback and ebook editions on Amazon. The paperback is for the affordable price of $14.99. For a limited time, you can purchase the ebook for 99 cents. Link is in the description. If you're a teacher or whoever, bulk orders at heavily discounted prices can be made by emailing me at etymosmax@gmail.com. That's etymosmax@gmail.com. To help support this network and our content, please consider contributing to our Patreon. You can find us on patreon.com/etymos. That is patreon.com/etymos. A pledge as little as $1 a month will grant you access to exclusive content, early releases, and community message boards. Thank you. And now for the final thought. The man who refuses to judge, who neither agrees nor disagrees, who declares that there are no absolutes and believes that he escapes responsibility, is the man responsible for all the blood that is now spilled in the world. Reality is an absolute. Existence is an absolute. A speck of dust is an absolute, and so too is a human life. Whether you live or die is an absolute. Whether you have a piece of bread or not is an absolute. Whether you eat your bread or see it vanish into a looter's stomach is an absolute. There are two sides to every issue. One side is right and the other is wrong. But the middle is always evil. The man who is wrong still retains some respect for truth, if only by accepting the responsibility of choice. But the man in the middle is the knave who blanks out the truth in order to pretend that no choice or values exist, who is willing to sit out the course of any battle, willing to cash in on the blood of the innocent or to crawl on his belly to the guilty, who dispenses justice by condemning both the robber and the robbed to jail, who solves conflicts by ordering the thinker and the fool to meet each other halfway. In any compromise between food and poison, it is only death that can win. In any compromise between good and evil, it is only evil that can profit. In that transfusion of blood which drains the good to feed the evil, the compromise is the transmitting rubber tube. And that is a quote from Ayn Rand, Atlas Shrugged. Take care, everyone.